they don't all have mics right now. SoCal member, old-time member Don Birchall, give us a wave here. Conrad Fletcher from Golden, Colorado, in the shadow of the Coors factory. Did you already wave?
Hardly.
Okay. Tom Thompson is next from Fullerton. And we have Joyce and Chuck White. We have Herb and Margaret Singe. We have George, quote, Red Ladner.
Red Scarface.
We have Peter Eastwood, followed by Ken Gooding, followed by Ellen Clendenen. Okay. We're in SoCal. We're celebrating the 75th anniversary of where the club started. Our local regional group has a new president, and believe it or not, it's George Ladner. So, Red, do you want to open this up and kind of set the flavor for discussing some highlights of your recollections in the early days? And maybe we'll keep it to 5 or 6 minutes. There's a bunch of people here, and then we can go back for a redo later, or some follow-up questions, or like in the debates, if you single out somebody for ridicule that's on the platform, they can have a rebuttal period here. So anyway, Red, you take it.
Well, turn him off. Okay. My tenure starts back in 1954 when this kid's father and uncle came to where I worked, which was in a junkyard in Pasadena. They were frequent attenders on Saturday to keep their daily drivers running. And they came up to me and said, Red, he said, you got to stop playing with these hot rods, and we're going to take you somewhere tonight. So be in a clean uniform at 4 o'clock. So here I am with my Ed's Auto Wrecking shirt on, and off we went to the LA County Museum, where Doug put $3 on the table, and Warwick put $3 on the table, and I became a member of the Horseless Carriage Club in 1954. And it started then, and it never quit. And so those guys were the stalwarts of our world. I eventually ended up working at JPL where they were, and I attended, as you've probably all heard, the SoCal group has a thing called the Holiday Motor Excursion. And what was I? You were in diapers when I first went on that.
Just out of diapers.
Just out of diapers. But we've now had the 55th year of that, and I think I've attended probably 42 or 3 of them, because I can remember them coming to my folks' house one Christmas morning, and Warwick saying to my mother, she says, sorry, he's gone for the next couple of 3 hours. And down the street, Santa Claus took me in a 1905 Buick. So it's an event that's been going on for years. And I've had such good fun in this club over the years. Back in, what was it, 62, 3, somewhere in there, we had a national tour up in Eureka, California. And I'd been working on a Cadillac for Bob Shipman, and I got it running about a week before the tour, and Bob says, well, you take it and make sure you test it out. And I went on this national tour for the first time in Eureka, California, and I've been going ever since, guys. It's been a wonderful time, and I've had a great, wonderful time meeting all of you people and sharing in this fun hobby. So, who's next?
Okay, I'm going to take it for a second and lead into our next victim, which is to your left. I watched this morning's excursion go by my house, probably about 1958. I was 13 years old. And it was Warwick dressed up in a Santa Claus suit, driving his 1906 Buick, going down to Lewis Cook's house, who lived on my street, who was an old-time pillar of the community who died, I think, a little bit too soon. Anyway, I got hooked a few years later and met Bob Shipman, who's in my neighborhood. and also Doug Eastwood. I was just a young brash kid, a little bit like Alex, but hopefully not quite that brash. At any rate, I started working on the Model T, and Bob Shippen and Doug were oh so gracious. Anytime I'm at work, come over to the house, use my tools, use anything you want, you know, you're working on this Model T, I don't have to be here, come on over. So I went down to Bob Shippen's house because I got a Cooper cutout that was cast iron and broken. I just heard you could raise cast iron. Well, as Con Fletcher would have said to me later, if he was there then, it looked like a hen sort of pooped on a rock when I got done. I made a real mess of it.
I've never.
No. So I knew that Doug Eastwood had a grinder up there. Well, the mess I made I had to grind off. So I scamper up to Doug's house, and he was at work. But Peter was there. He and his brother were working on a skateboard. Peter was 11, and I was 17. So I proceed to grind this down. Peter walks up in his typical kind of a serious scowl and says, "My dad says you're not supposed to grind brass on that wheel." And he was right. Peter's sort of been telling me what I've been doing wrong ever since. Peter, it's all yours.
Well, I'm gonna back up a little bit to try and qualify why I'm even up here. For those of you who don't know, my dad and uncle were real early members in the club, and my dad actually went to his first club meeting in 1940. And I think at that time he had a 1914 Model T Roadster. Of course, they drove Model Ts to school and grew up on Model Ts, so they always had a Model T around. And I think Harold Graff took them to their first club meeting. But my dad was married only 2 years, and my oldest brother was a baby, and 1940 was a busy time for a new family, and so he didn't really go to many club meetings. Then there was a big 4-year interruption right there in the 40s, and then in 46 he finally joined the club, and I think it was about 2 or 3 months later he got my uncle to join the club. And they were, for those of you who don't know, they were twins, and the first car they bought and restored together was their 1905 Buick that they did they bought in 46 and finished the restoration in 47, and we still have that car. And then my dad, they got another 1905 Buick, and it went on from there. But I showed up somewhere along the line. There was 5 kids in our family, and I was number 4, and so I guess I got born into the club, and I guess that qualifies me for being up here in this old town. This holiday Christmas tour that these two guys talked about, just a quick little history on that. On Christmas morning, there's 5 kids in my family, and we'd open our gifts, and we'd crank up whatever old car was in the garage, and we'd drive up to my uncle's house at the north end of Pasadena and see what my 2 cousins got for Christmas, and they'd crank up their 1905 Buick, and we'd go around the corner to Bill Collier's house to see what his daughter Nancy Collier got for Christmas, and they'd crank up their 1910 Maxwell. Then we'd drive over to Paloma Street. We haven't left Pasadena yet. Drive over to Paloma Street and see what Butch and Phyllis Walgamot got for Christmas, and then they'd hop in their dad's 1913 Model T, and then we'd go over to the Mendelssohns to see what their daughter got. And Christmas Day, we'd never leave Pasadena, but we'd end up with 10 or 12 cars driving around. And this started in 1955. Well, after a while, the rest of the club started hearing about what was going on Christmas Day in Pasadena, and people would start showing up at our house on Christmas morning because they wanted to go on the tour. And it became a club event, and then we finally moved it to the weekend between Christmas and New Year's, and like Red said, I think we had our 55th annual one.
375 cars.
We upped the date. You can bring something big. Well, my dad upped it to pre-war cars. Then it got too big, so then he cut it back to 1932 in older cars, because he had a 1932 Indian he wanted to ride. And that's where it all came from.
But you have the tour, and you get the little insignia in your headlight that says you get a map. And you got to be 32 and older. I mean, cars 32 and older to have a map. But you should see that everybody's behind us. And when we get to the coffee stop, we figure we're going to have, 120 cars that are 32 and older, and you serve 700 cups of coffee. That's the way it is.
Yeah, we used to try and get an RSVP head count on this deal, and of course, you know how that goes. We finally just, well, my dad and uncle did it for 37 years, and then they handed it to me, and I've done it for the last however many years. Well, we just, again, the spectators that tag along, because it's so much fun to watch the old cars go down the road, we leave the parking lot. You don't get your map till you drive out the driveway. So the donut stop's always in a park, and there's a million parks in Pasadena, so it's always a mystery, because you don't want anybody to know where the coffee and donuts are. Now it's just a flat deal. It's 40 gallons of coffee, 20 gallons of hot chocolate, 15 gallons of orange juice, and 60 dozen donuts. That usually doesn't run out too soon.
Okay. Let's see.
You want to finish up on this end of the table, or you want to go over to your side?
No, there's two down there. They're near you. You go ahead and introduce them.
All right. To my immediate right is Alan Clendenen, SoCal boy for many years and started fooling with old cars. How old, Alan?
14.
14. And Ken Gooding, tell them how you got involved with old cars and the first time you found out somebody else liked old cars, Ken.
Well, I'm not sure if I remember what story you're talking about there, but,
12 years old.
yeah, I was 13 years old when I went to my first car meet, which was a national meet put on by General Motors. And then I went up and saw in about 54 is when I joined, and I think it was right then that they had a tour from LA to San Francisco. Somebody might be able to tell me there's a little bit different there. That's correct, yeah. Anyway, the tour, we went and followed the cars up to Santa Barbara, and they were all driving, and some of them were restored and some of them were original. But back then, restored meant that you had polished the brass after you picked the car up and put new gas in the tank, and that was the restoration. That's when you could find good cars in that kind of condition. But then at the swap meet is where all the cars came in, and then you saw these cars for the first time when you would go to a meet back then. So every time a meet came up, you wanted to go to the meet for no other reason to see what somebody's pulled out of the barn. And there were always cars you'd never heard of before and knew even existed. And there it was, the guy, had brought it by. So you tried to get to those meets to see what was happening in the club, and I instantly started working for a fellow named Ted Bowers Sr., who Jr. is still in the club and runs the car. But Ted Bowers Sr. Lived about a mile from me, so every time I went past his garage and it was open, I went in and talked to him, and he knew I was really interested in it. And so I went to work for him, and we just learned together how to restore old cars. And there weren't that many people doing it, or if they were doing it, they didn't know about the other people. In fact, I made a little list of the big collections that were in existence back in about 50 to 55 in there. And the list in the West Coast here consists of Dr. Schaefer, who had over 150 cars. Lindley Bothwell, who a lot of you visited, I guess, this week. And that collection used to be a little bit bigger, but it's pretty basically much the feel of it that it was always. And he was doing things with the cars. Lindley was out, he had some races. He had a race in Santa Monica along the cliff up there. And I went to that when I was 13 years old. And, you start learning things pretty quick when you've never seen an old car before. And I was very lucky because my father was a mechanic for American Airlines. And that meant we could fly all over the country on vacation time and stuff. So when I was 14 years old, we went back east to the Long Island Auto Museum, and then we went over to Detroit to see the collections over in Detroit. And then on the West Coast, there was, as I said before, Lindley Bothwell, Dr. Schaefer, and Art Austria. Now, there were other collections, but I think those are the ones that there were 150 cars or more in. And we visited those when I was very young, and that, you know, taught me a lot about cars that a lot of people didn't get a chance to do because they couldn't travel like I could. We didn't have any money, but we could travel and act like we had it. And we saw all kinds of cars from back east and here. So it just made it fun, and yeah, I don't know, maybe some people have some questions. I can go on forever about the different stories that, you know, are personal to me.
Let's talk to them a little bit about Harris, whatever else you want to talk about.
Well, I think I'll start off with how I got in the hobby. And when I was about 10 years old, the Revell company came out with a bunch of little plastic models that you could put together. I got one of those models as a gift and put it together, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So, and I got another model, and then there were some trend books that were put out by Bob Gottlieb, who was a member of the club here, that wrote some of those books, and I had a couple of them. And I got a couple of Floyd Climbers books, who was also an early member of the Horseless Carriage Club. And so I learned about the cars I was putting together. And we were going someplace with my parents, and I think I was about 12 years old, and we happened to go by a place called the Buffalo Ranch in Orange County where they raised buffalo. And it happened to be the first meeting of the Newport Beach region of the Horseless Carriage Club, which is now the Orange Empire. And so we stopped in there and saw these cars, and I remember the people and riding bicycles around in the Newport Beach, Costa Mesa area of California. I stumbled onto, with my friends, some of these people that were at that meet. And one was Nelson Holmwood, who owned this locomobile that's over in the corner over here. And he had a collection of cars, and we stopped, and he was a regular stop before long to see what he was working on, this and that. And then they had a swap meet not too long after that. And I went to that, heard about it, rode my bicycle down there, and then I met Bobby Babcock, who currently owns the locomobile. And unfortunately, Bobby isn't able to be here today, but we're still good friends. He was 12 years old and I was 14. And then I was riding my bicycle on another street one day, and I spotted this 1924 Rio in the driveway. Well, I rode by there for several months and finally got the courage to stop in and see if the car was for sale. It was, and it was only $50, which was quite a bit of money back in the mid-50s. But anyway, I bought the car, and that was my first step into horseless carriages. And then I joined the Horseless Carriage Club that same year, which that ended up being the early part of 1956. And I've been active with it ever since. But we had a lot of fun, and I don't know, it was about a year or so later, we heard about Ted Bowers that had this collection of cars over near in West Los Angeles near the LA airport. And that's when I met Ken for the first time. We got to be good friends, and we started going on tours together and going out scratching around looking for cars. And visiting car collections, and we got to know a lot of people and a lot of the early members of the club. And we progressed on from there, and then eventually Ken went to work for Harrah's in Reno, and he was Mr. Harrah's assistant, and I'll let him tell you about that. And then a few years later, I went up there and went to work for him. So that was a fantastic experience, and of course, learning a lot about cars. I learned a lot about cars before that. Another guy that was in the early days of the club, who had an automotive machine shop and did primarily work for early cars and made parts for people, and his name was Ralph McCune. And some of you will remember the 1907 Thomas Flyer that Harrah's had that was painted kind of an off-white color. It was known as Blondie. And Ken here ended up owning it for quite a long time. Anyway, Ralph was the original chauffeur on that car in 1907, and he was around Los Angeles in the automotive industry, and he always had a lot of great stories to tell about the early days of automobiles. As a young kid, I just soaked that up like a sponge. So my knowledge of cars increased dramatically within a short period of time. But anyway, as time has gone on, we've had a lot of good adventures and gone on a lot of great tours, owned a lot of great cars. And so a big part of my life has been centered around this club. And I thank the club for the members that we knew here. So, maybe somebody else would like to tell some story.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Come down to this end, we have a member who's put a lot of effort into this convention here, actually. I'll let him tell you a little bit about it. He probably lives nearer to the spot than maybe anybody else. But his father was a pillar of the Lincoln automobile community, and Tom's right there behind him now. Tom and Sawyer. Excuse me, Leland.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Leland Powell, named after Henry M. Leland, who did a lot with Cadillac in the early days, and then, of course, started the Lincoln. I'd like to just tell a couple of stories. A good friend of my father's was Art Austria. He was member 21 of the Horseless Carriage. And he was basically his gopher. He went around every day after work. He'd go there and they'd work in the Simplex garage. It was 2 blocks from the Venice Ocean out there. These giant clouds of fog would come into these cars. Like Alan said, about 150 cars in there, and it was amazing. And Art was an amazing guy. He was huge and powerful. The first time I met him, my dad said, "Take him over this bottle of pop." And I handed it to Art, and he used his teeth to open the bottle. I was always scared of him. So I used to love listening to my father's stories of Art and stuff. And the Simplex there was Art's car. And my dad was working for Art, and Art said, "Hey, I bought this Simplex. It's in Pocatello, Idaho. Come back there with me." So my dad took off of work, and off they went. And the deal was to trade the car for a modern car with some money from Joe Watson, who was a wonderful car collector and did a lot for the Harris Museum. So they made the deal, and in the deal was a World War I dump truck, great big Liberty truck, huge thing, probably does all at 23 miles an hour. And they shoved that Simplex in the back, and back they come to California. It was pretty uneventful until they got to the Grapevine here. And then as they went to come up over that hill, that truck just couldn't do it. And of course my dad was in his 20s then, so like he said, I was pretty weak and scared. And Art just kept going, and Art just finally took that truck and just buried it right into the back of the mountain, unloaded the Simplex, and he took this horrible rusty chain and wrapped it around that beautiful leaf spring in the back and hooked it onto that truck, put my dad behind the wheel, and he pulled that right over the hill and just kept going all the way to Venice. You know, and he just things like that. And then, you know, and here he is, this powerful guy that seems like he's so tough, but in his heart, you could tell he loved the cars. And so another story about him I always loved was Dad came to work one day at his shop there at the Simplex garage, and Art was white. He's like, "I had a dream last night." And he proceeds to tell this story to my dad of when he came to California, which was about 1919. He came in a great big early Chadwick. He said he had a flat tire every day. If he didn't have a flat tire that day, he'd have 2 the next. And he was in the middle of nowhere, some desert area, and he come across this gully with no spares, and both tires blew out. He looked around, there's nothing but vultures. So after he got done crying on the running board, he saw a farmhouse, just a speck, and he just walked for hours till he got there. And there's this guy there, busy working on some project, and this guy says, "Yeah, I got a horse and a wagon. The closest train station that you can get your tires is, you know, half a day away. But I can't get there for a week. I got to finish this project." So Art stayed there, and he got the project done, and he got the tires and everything, and then he had to stay another week. Well, in the course of this time, he discovered there was a Pope Toledo in the barn. These people had been coming across many years before him and had carburation trouble. They paid the old farmer to leave the car there, and They went on the train and never returned. So we flash forward to about 1950 something, about 52 or 3 probably, and Art has a dream. The car's still there. So my dad had to wait about 2 weeks to get some time off of work, and Art's bugging him all the time, when are we gonna go, when are we gonna go? So they went, and of all things, my dad had some kind of a T hot rod, and they go all the way there, and they're down this dirt road, and they're bouncing over these roads and ruts, and they found the faster they could go, it'd go off the top of the bumps. And up ahead, they saw this white area. It was a big gully of alkali, and they hit that. They're both covered in white, you know. And finally, they find a kid out on the donkey, and they tell him about this farmhouse, and he says, yeah, over here. And as they got closer, pretty soon Art was like, that's the rock, that's the tree, turn here. And they find it. Here's this farmhouse with this barn. And they go beat on the door, and this rumpled up ancient guy comes out, and then he explains to them, 2 weeks ago, the car had been scrapped. They open the garage door, and the headlight and the jack is there. Art picked the headlight up and that jack like little babies. He got in the car and didn't say a word all the way home. You know, this was a real collector. And the people that did all this for us to save these cars in these early days is why I brought my stuff out today and really wanted to, you know, give respect to them. But let me just finish up with a newer story with people that you might remember from the movies. I was gifted to be around a lot of those, and some of those were real true collectors. And some of them had a great sense of humor. And I was on an early motorcycle tour with Steve McQueen. He was a good friend of mine, and we rode a lot. He liked the fact that I was a kid that knew everything. He thought this was great. So he was on a 15 Indian, and he was stubborn. He wouldn't keep 50 pounds of air in his tires. So he's had a flat, we was on our 4th flat on this one bike tour. And, you know, everybody knew it was him and Allie McGraw on the sidecar. So they wanted to, you know, some people would cheer him, but this couple on a Triumph motorcycle came by as close as they could in the dirt, covered us in dirt, you know. And I was mad, I was a kid. And he's like, no, don't worry, we'll get him back. So we got to the next stop. And of course, because he was Steve McQueen, all these people around him, and I kind of walked off to one side. And a little while later, I saw him going, come in. And we got over there, and he says, look, this is that guy's Triumph. And he pulled off the spark plug wire, and he put his cigarette out inside the spark plug connection and put it on. And he says, watch this. So that guy came out with his girlfriend, and he stared at Steve and that crowd, and he got on there, and after he kicked that thing for about a half hour, we got that Indian fired up, and we chugged by, and Steve goes, hey, I bet when you blew by us a while ago, I bet your spark plug wire fell off. That guy was so furious. So anyway, that's what's great. We can keep a sense of humor and preserve history, and I hope that we can show the world with all these modern problems how we can use the knowledge of yesterday to fix today's problems. And I just really appreciate you guys letting me talk. Thanks.
Leland never ceases to be a character with a lot of story. I have an idea he has a lot more. Next is Don Birchall, who has been in the SoCal group from probably as long as I can remember. The 60s. So Don's going to tell you a few stories.
Yeah, I grew up in La Canada, California. The thing that got me interested in old cars was when I was in the 2nd grade, we went to the LA County Museum, and they had all those cars in that museum at that time. And they had showcases of all these old car parts. And that really got me interested in old cars. Then we went to the Parker Lyons Pony Express Museum. And in 1949, Parker Lyons died. In 1955, Bill Hare bought the collection and took it to Reno. Then when I was 15, I got a Model A station wagon. And there was 4 or 5 Horseless Carriage members in La Canada at that time, Ken Manley and Tom Sharpstein. And they invited me to go on some of the local Horseless Carriage tours in my Model A station wagon. And then in the mid-60s, I joined the Horseless Carriage Club and started going to the Reno swap meets. In 74, I started going to the swap meets in Hershey. I got to know 3 guys in San Bernardino pretty well, Joe Ballard and Al Vivian and Joe Ballard's passed away. Al Vivian is still alive, but he's in a home. And Doc Schaefer. And Doc was really a character. In fact, I now own his 1915 Dodge. First national tour I went on was in 1969 at Lake Tahoe, and Doc Schaefer had his 1909 Ford on the tour, and it had a knot on the side of that tire as big as my fist. And Doc had a pile of tires, and I was young and strong, and I says, Doc, how about let me change that tire for you before you go out on the road? He said, oh no, that tire's got plenty of miles left in it. Sure enough, he made the whole damn tour with that tire. Anyhow, that's about all I really have to say, I guess.
Thank you, Don. Well, I think the next person in line here needs no introduction. Goes way back, has more cars than most all of us had, and I'm gonna let let him tell you about it.
Talking about me? I'm gonna stand up because I've been sitting. Hello, okay, I'm Conrad Fletcher from Golden, Colorado. Just recently had the privilege of being president of the Colorado Region Group again. Started out my life as collecting cars. I don't really remember when, but I was a kid born in Nebraska on a farm, and all I knew and never had heard of was Model T Fords. Never, ever, ever knew there was such a thing as a locomobile Chadwick or something. Never, ever heard of it. Anyway, my source of supply was my dad's feedlot, where there were hogs and cattle being fed for market, and there was a bunch of old wagons. They always took these old Model Ts and cut them up, made cornfield wagons out of them, corn picking wagon. And lo and behold, I looked and I saw one with a Ford hood cap on it, and I said, wow, I've hit the jackpot. Finally, I got the thing out of there, and it didn't need any sandblasting or anything, because the hogs and the cattle had been rubbing on it for about 10 years prior to me getting out, and it was smooth and shiny. The underneath side was shiny because the hogs were going underneath. The top side was shiny because the cattle were rubbing on it. So, hey, I had the chassis. And then later on I found out in this little one-horse town I lived in, there was a guy that had a whole bunch of Model Ts. So I got started, and they had an old Model T 1926. I thought that was the oldest thing I'd ever seen, was a Model T, because consequently that was my first restoration. And my downfall. Starting to collect other things, and I never knew anything about these other kind of cars other than Model Ts. When I went to college in Fort Collins, then I started working on Colorado A&M students, and at CSU now for football fans. And anyway, my first convention was at Pasadena at the Huntington and Sheridan, yes. And I was still in school and working, and we'd drive, after we'd get off work, like we'd quit about 5:30, 6 o'clock, get in the car and drive clear out here and be here the next morning for the convention. So you know, we meant business by driving that far, that long, never got a motel and just kept on plowing on. And that was with John Scott and Nichols' parents back in the 60s, late 60s that was. But then several years later I started meeting some of you wonderful people and some of the elderly people that had gotten us acquainted with old cars. And the Eastwoods were really the ones I remember because they always had a Buick fired up chassis or something at this Pasadena hotel. And that got me enthused, and I have a picture today yet of Warwick and our, excuse me, our Stephen Sturrier side by side, and underneath he wrote the Sturrier Boys, and I've always treasured that. Other than that, I don't have much to say, but thank you all for helping. Oh, one thing, being president of this wonderful organization, Horseless Carriage Club of America, and I related that quite a bit at a board meeting here a while back. Anyway, you don't know what you've got until you've been there, and that is being a member or past president or past board member of this wonderful organization. I dare say there's nothing greater in the world than this club right here.
Amen.
Well said.
Were you talking about elderly people when you looked at me?
I'm looking at her down there.
I'm going to stand like he did. It's easier to talk. My name's Tom Thompson, and I live in Orange County, California. That's down by that little park called Disneyland, which when I grew up was a strawberry field. And just to give you a little history of how I got connected with antique cars, my father and his father lived in Iowa. And in 1910, my grandfather came to see his sister who lived in Riverside, California. And the sister had a daughter that lived in Long Beach, and she had an electric car. And they drove the electric car from Riverside to Long Beach, and on the way back home, they ran out of juice in a tiny little town called Fullerton. And so my grandfather took his family, three at that time, back to Iowa, went through one more winter as a railway locomotive engineer on the Milwaukee St. Paul, and said, heck with this, I'm going back to California. So he came back to California, and he remembered the little town of Fullerton, so he decided to live there, and he had a partner who also came with him, and they didn't know what they were going to do, but they heard there was a garage for sale. And he didn't have to look very far because it was the only garage in the whole city. And much to his surprise, when he walked in, it was owned by a lady mechanic, Lillian Yeager. She was about 6'6" tall. And my grandfather said she could change tires and scrape bearings and overhaul engines like any man could. Now, he'd never driven anything but a locomotive on a train. He never drove a car, didn't know how to work on cars, although he knew mechanics from the railroad. So he and his friend went to LA Trade Tech College in Los Angeles to learn how to work on cars and how to drive. They came back and took over the garage, and it had the Overland Agency at that time. He had that for a while, and then later took over the Chandler Agency in exchange for the Overland Agency. My father was asked to come to the garage after school and polish the brass on the cars that were sitting there being serviced. So as a young man in grammar school, he spent a lot of time polishing brass in the garage. And a man who owned 2 packing houses, and those of you that remember orange groves and packing houses, by the way, that was an orange grove we were in. I talk to younger people and have to explain what an orange grove is to them. And they were like the computer gurus today. They had the money. They're the ones that had the money. And this gentleman had a 1906 Tucson Maxwell. And he decided to trade it in 1914 for a Chandler. My dad was then 10 years old and thought that Maxwell was just a car for him to drive around town, since you didn't have to have driver's licenses. And so he told his father, I'd like to drive that car as my own car. My grandfather didn't think that was such a good idea. So he ordered a worn-out Maxwell to be cut up for scrap. And that hurt my dad. He never forgot that. In 1936, he was reading the LA Times and he saw an advertisement in Riverside for a 1906 Maxwell. And so he went out to see it, and on the back of the seat, it said 1906 Maxwell, 100,000 miles and still going strong. And he bought it for $125. And my mom got really upset because he spent so much money in the car. A piece of junk, I think, was the word that was mentioned. And He at that time had a Stanley steamer also, he got in 1932. Now, I didn't see any of this happen because I didn't come along until 1940. However, my introduction to antique cars was a little Maxwell because I came home from the hospital in that car. And I went with my father all around every Saturday in that car. And I learned to drive on the car. He wouldn't let me take it to get my driver's license, so I had to drive a regular car for some reason. In the early years of the club in 1937, he met a friend named Tom Matthews who was down near Fontana and Rialto. He also had steam cars. And he told him, Raymond, you should come to this meeting. There's a bunch of guys getting together going to start a club. So my dad went to either the second or third meeting of the club and joined shortly thereafter. One of his friends was a founding member, Robert Lingo, Bob Lingo. And Bob was just a young boy. He was a lot younger than everybody else. And Bob, when World War II started, joined the Navy. And he didn't have any family here. I believe he was an orphan and didn't have any family around. Was going to have to get rid of the cars. He had a 1914 Rio and 2 Model Ts. And he was really heartbroken that he'd have to get rid of the cars to go into service. And my dad said, Bob, I'll keep the cars for you until you get out of the service. So he brought them over and my dad had the cars. I came along and there was the Rio and the 2 Model Ts. And so I grew up with Maxwell and the Rio, and we went on the different trips in the Rio. We also were on, with Maxwell on the first trip, first caravan. The Rio also was on that caravan. The picture to your left over here, the big picture, is the Rio. It's my father and myself on the tour to Coronado Island. Someone took these pictures, and I never remember them being taken. And President Fullerton called us one day and said, I think we have a picture of your father in our garage. And we went there, and sure enough, there was that picture. They don't know how it got there. It was there when they bought the house. And then later, at the 50th year convention, they asked for pictures to be brought out, and there was about 10 or 12 of those pictures showed up. Right down at the bottom of Torrey Pines Grade, right along where the ocean and the highway passed there. And I remember that because that was the first time my father ever let me drive a car on a public street. I drove off the ferry boat up to the Coronado Hotel, and I was really thrilled to be able to drive the Rio. And like I said, it was in the first caravan, and somehow we ended up with the plate. This is a plate that was given out by the club for the very first caravan, and it has the title of the car, 1914 Rio. And if anybody knows who bought that car, from John Mathis down there, Escondido, I'd like to contact him because I think that plate should go back to that car where it belongs. We then, Bob became a very good friend of ours, and my dad helped him go through mortuary school. He was a mortician, but you wouldn't know it to talk to him. He was the funniest guy you'd ever want to talk to. And I remember at a annual meeting, my dad could never tie a bow tie. And my mom once tied his bow ties. And so my mom was someplace, we couldn't find her, and it was getting time for dinner. My dad was getting sort of excited he couldn't get his bow tie tied. Bob Lingo walked by and I said, Bob, could you go in and see my dad for a minute? And I followed him in and Bob said, Raymond, he goes, what do you need? He says, can you tie this bow tie? Bob says, I'll tie your bow tie anytime you want to as long as you're not laying down. So that joke went on for many years. When my father passed away, the 4th generation of the mortuary family that lived in Fullerton took care of the services, and I told him, you can do everything but put on his tie. And I called Bob Lingo, and he came over and tied his tie for him. And that's how long these relationships last. Years and years goes on. After the war was over, Bob came one day to pick up the Rio. After all, it was his. I came home from school. I was probably about 12 years old at that time. And there's a strange man backing my Rio out of our garage. And I go, what are you doing with my car? And he goes, it's not yours, it's mine. I'm taking it home. I said, you can't take that car home. It belongs to us. And we had quite a little altercation. And my father arrived and had to sadly tell me the honest story, because he never told me to that time that car wasn't ours. So I didn't talk about lingo for about 2 years. But we went over that and got over it. We get good friends. The Maxwell, we used to drive around a lot. My dad liked to go to Palm Springs. And Palm Springs then was only about 2 blocks long. And we'd go down on Saturday and come back on Sunday. Sunday morning, we'd always eat breakfast, angle parking, like the old towns had. Parked the Maxwell, went in the cafe, had breakfast, and came out, and the car was gone. Now today, we get really excited. We sort of looked around, and I asked my dad, somebody took our car. He said, well, I don't see how that's possible. First of all, they'd have to know how to drive it and how to start it. It can't possibly be somebody steal it. Right then, we heard that coming around the corner. Here's 2 old guys coming down the street in our Maxwell. Great big pot bellies, beards skirt down to their belts, coveralls, caps. They pulled right in front of us, shut off the magneto, shut off the gas, put the spark in the right place, put the drum, set the handbrake, got out. Another guy looked at the first guy and says, George, never thought we'd get to drive one of those again, did you? Just walking along and saw Maxwell and decided to take it for a drive. But like Con says, there's so many people, and I was fortunate being very young to meet a lot of the family members. First time I came to the Bothwell Ranch, we drove our little Maxwell from Orange County all the way out here. And on the way home, we went around the corner and there's this little snap and the car quit moving. Well, we broke an axle key. About 10 minutes went by and we're trying to figure out how we're going to get home. And here comes Barney Rademacher, early member, in his little Maxwell. And he comes around the corner and he stopped and he goes, having problems? My dad says, yeah, the car won't move. He said, well, put it in gear. I said, well, the drive shaft's turning, so it must be an axle key. You got a jack? Yeah, we got a jack. So we jacked it up and he had a little toolbox. He had a hook puller, pulled the wheel off. And he said, yeah, this is an axle key, all right. I was standing there going, where are we going to get an axle key? Barney reaches in his duster bucket and he goes like this and he fishes around. Yeah, that's a Maxwell key. Put it in, put the wheel back on, and we went on home. I go, now who else would carry an axle key for a Maxwell but Barney Rademacher? Everett Miller was another one of my dad's close friends. He had a huge collection of automotive books and memorabilia. And he would come over very often, and they'd trade books back and forth. Elmer Newberry was one of my favorites. He had a Stanley steamer. A little terrier dog. You know, where you go at the General Motors meets and stuff, there'd be Elmer and his little terrier dog in his Stanley steamer. The Eastwoods, I can remember how young they looked to me. They were just like young kids when they started compared to the rest of the people that were driving the cars. I always had the Buicks, like you say. They were always really sharp cars. Len Roos was an interesting person. He had one-cylinder Cadillac. And he was one of the people that developed Technicolor lens. Really interesting person to talk to. Ken Sorensen had a premiere and scared all his kids by making the klaxon horn sound. He could imitate a klaxon right behind you. You'd think the car was sitting right behind you. And these people all let you ride in the cars. That's the one thing I sort of see a decline of, is I don't see the kids changing cars. We used to carry a card on the local tours, and I'd ride in his car, and then he'd sign my card, and I'd ride in the next person's car. And at the end of the tour, we'd see whichever kid had more signatures now to get a little reward of some kind. That way you got to know the people, you got to have fun in the cars. Because you always rode in your car. It was always there to ride in. It was fun, but don't forget how important it is, just the person standing on the street, to give them a ride. The highlight of my dad's career with the Maxwell was probably 1947. Anaheim, California had a Halloween parade. And they had a special Grand Marshal that year, and they asked my dad to drive him in the Maxwell. And that Grand Marshal was Jack Benny. A week before the parade, we broke the axle of the Maxwell. The parade started at 6 o'clock Saturday. At 4 o'clock Saturday, the axle was still in the lathe. They finally got it out, put it all together, and told my dad, you better test it. My dad said, put the grease in it, and I'm leaving. And I rode with him down to where we picked up Jack Benny, and he arrived in a big Cadillac limousine. Of course, I had to get out and stand there. My mom, I couldn't go with him. He walked around the car twice. He got in, sat back next to my dad, and he looked at my dad, and he said, I'll be damned, it is a Maxwell. and probably one of the few rides in a real Maxwell you ever had. That picture's over there on the piano, if you ever want to look at the picture of him in the Maxwell. And that was one of the most fun things I think my dad ever did with the Maxwell. Years later, in the Foreign Affairs Council meeting in Los Angeles, my dad was walking up to the line where they're introducing the speaker to everybody. Somebody was sitting at a table, pulled his sleeve, and he turned around, and Jack Benny was there. He says, "Aren't you the judge that drove me in a Maxwell in Anaheim?" My dad couldn't believe he remembered that.
Wow.
He'd have changed in appearance a lot. But just the person standing on the street is important. Garden Grove has a strawberry festival every year. My dad always went to that. We're sitting in the Maxwell waiting for the parade to start. Little Joyce comes up and stands right by the curb, puts his hands behind his back, and he just stands there looking at it. My dad looked down, and this most parades had time to waste, waiting for him to get lined up. He said, "Would you like to take a ride in this car?" And this little boy's eyes got a bigger round. "Yes, yes." "Well, you go ask your parents if you can do it." He ran in the house. Mother came out and said, "He shouldn't be bothering you like that." And my dad says, "No bother." So I got out, and he took off, a little boy about 9 years old. They went around the block, and he came back, and the kid jumped out of the car and he said, "You two want to see my railroad in the backyard?" We thought, a railroad? And a 9-year-old? We maybe a Lionel train or something like that? Went in the back, and here's a railroad all built out of just nothing. He made the wheels out of bicycle wheels. It was about the size of a table. And you could actually ride in the cars and pedal us around on this track that was made out of 2x4 standing on edge around the backyard. And that little boy's name was Bobby Babcock. And you never know when you have that chance to get that little spark start. And my dad always believed that the best thing about an antique car is that you'll talk to people that would never talk to you otherwise. And don't be afraid to give them a ride. Don't be afraid to let them touch the car. No, they can't hurt it. Let them feel what it feels like when it's running. Let them sit in a 2-cylinder car when it's running. Let them hear the chain sing as you go down the road. Those are the things you always remember. Nelson Homer restored that locomobil. Loved that car. They drove it clear across the United States. And one thing Nelson told my dad as he was getting ready up in years, he says, "I want somebody that will take that car and love it like I did." And he picked the right person. Because Bobby loves that car just like Nelson does. Thank you very much.
You know, it gets inbred in these kids. Tommy had a bus company. I don't know if he still does or not. Thompson Bus Company in Fullerton. And for the 50th annual convention, which we had at the Universal Sheraton right here, Tommy's company did all the buses for us. So he hasn't fallen away from the tree 25 years later, that's for sure.
And we're using the same buses on this convention.
25-year-old.
Almost. Well, we've got left 2 couples. I think they, not to tell any secrets, but I think they're the 4 oldest people on the thing still.
Careful.
Yeah, Chuck's the oldest, my mom's the youngest,
Happy birthday.
and they're basically SoCal and East. So maybe we'll talk to Chuck, let Chuck talk, and Chuck and Joyce talk for a little while, and finish up kind of West Coast, western Mississippi, then we'll bring them Easterners and Jersey people in, and let them talk about a few things, okay? Go ahead, Chuck and Joyce.
Hey, I'm Chuck White. I was born on July 30th of 1926, and I didn't know it at the time, but that was Henry Ford's 66th birthday. And so I guess it's more than just luck that I have a profound interest in his Model T Fords. And I had several in high school, and when I left for the Navy, I had to leave them. But following the war, my final year in college, I had met most of the requirements, so I had some leisure time, I had an extra $100, and so I bought a 1915 Ford, and it had a decent paint job and ran well, but the brass did need polishing. But it shows what we could get for $100 at the time anyway. The national tour of the Horseless Club at that time passed near the ranch that my parents had. I was there with this Model T. I was a 23-year-old kid. When I went to where they had stopped, I knew who the president was and his wife, and you were privileged to visit Ann's ranch, and that's where a lot of this hobby really started. And anyway, I was a brash young 23-year-old kid, and I went up to Ann and said, I have a Model T Ford, and I'd like to join your club. Ann is a really dear, gracious person, and so she was gracious to me, got me an application, and Lynn and I, of course, in subsequent years, became pretty good friends. Lindley was born in 1900, so he grew up with this whole automotive industry, and he was smart enough to see the direction it was going and was really one of the founders. So this club owes a lot to Lindley and to Ann in its founding years. By 1954, I had married my beautiful but shy wife, and it so happens that that year, the national tour, which took place just a couple weeks after our marriage ceremony, was a progressive tour to the Bay Area in San Francisco. So that became our honeymoon. That national tour of that year became our honeymoon. It involved a 3-day drive to the Bay Area and several days up there. Well, people on the tour knew that we were brand new newlyweds, so along the way, first night we stopped at a hotel. And of course, by the next morning, they had pilfered some souvenirs for us. So we have coat hangers and some ashtrays and some other embossed things from Santa Maria Inn. The next night it was up to Monterey, and we still have some of those souvenirs. That's the one thing I do somewhat miss, is the opportunity for those progressive tours. This is something over 400 miles up there. We did it in 3 days, and at that time you could do it without feeling threatened by the rest of the traffic on the highway. A few years after that, I was a fairly young high school auto shop teacher by that time, and I needed some employment in the summertime. I'd become good friends with Ted Bowers because we met each other on local events and shared an interest. Ted was restoring automobiles, so I, having a free summer, went to work for Ted in the summers, doing restoration work in his shop. Ted also would hire young, talented people that he felt had a future. And the first one I met was Ken Gooding. Ken was a young high school guy, and I was this auto shop teacher working summers. So Ken and I go back a long ways. As Ken moved on with his life, the next person to show up was Bob Babcock. And Bob has the Locomobile over there in the corner. So we owe a lot to some of these other pioneers who helped us along the way. And as you ladies know, when you marry somebody with an old car, you get more than just a nice guy with a car. You get a whole movement, a way of life that, and so my hat's off to the women because we owe a lot to them too.
I think Chuck has told about everything there is that I could add. And I think it was great to, as I said, marry into the old car business. And we became a membership of the Horseless Carriage Club, and I have never regretted 1 minute of it. I'm still with him.
56 years later.
Before I pass this to my new friend Herb, I did bring along my certificate that I got when I joined the club, which was in November of 1950. Again, I'm privileged. This was signed by Lindley Bothwell as the president at that time, and the secretary was Warwick Eastwood, Peter Eastwood's uncle. I compared notes with Herb. He has an earlier number. My number is 2404, and his is 2080. So he's 300 or so numbers before, and that was during that year. So the club was really booming along at that time, picking up something over 300 members in a few months. My number being 2404. The club at that time was just 13 years old, so they picked up 2,400 members, and they were booming along. The club was really moving at that time. As I say, I am pleased that I was able to meet the real pioneers who formed this in 1937, because they were a very forward-looking group to start this at that time and get it going. I'd like to introduce my new best friend, Herb Singe.
Before you talk that, Red would like to say something.
Chuck and Joyce, I think it's about 40 years ago, went on a tour to the Rocky Mountain Ramble in Colorado, and they took their 49 or 50 Ford pickup with their 15 center door sedan on a single axle trailer, and they went on that tour. And surprisingly enough, 30 years later, they had a Rocky Mountain Ramble, and they took the same pickup, the same car, on the same trailer, and the same two people. And that's commendable.
The first tour was in 1956, the second one 1986. I still have the pickup, I still have the Model T, I still have the trailer, I still have the wife. And if they're doing it again in 2016, we'll be there.
All right.
All right, my mom's gonna go next, because she knows if she lets my dad start talking, she'll never get a turn. But before you do that, Mom, I need Red to tell people about his recent escapade, and then what you need to do when you get in, first thing you need to do when you get into a car.
When you get into a car, the first thing you do is put your seatbelt on, not like the jerk that's sitting here that has his forehead split and a few things from last Wednesday night. So wear your seatbelts.
This lady back there wore her seatbelt, she's in the same perfect condition she was a couple days before.
That's right.
My mom, one thing she's gonna dispute with you, Chuck. She says she got the old cars, but she's still looking for the nice guy.
Shut out.
Okay.
Okay, they tell you all the upsides of the antique cars. Now you're gonna hear the downside. So, I got involved with antique cars, I guess, back in the 40s. And when I met Herb, he was restoring a 1923 Ford Coupe. So all my friends on date night went to the movies or went to the local dances, and I went to a one-car garage. And that's where I spent my date nights. But it's all right, once he got the car restored, and we took it out on runs, all the fumes came up through the floorboards. And I was so nauseous, I couldn't die quick enough. But anyway, I was young and I was in love, okay? So it worked out all right. Then after that, he got a 1904 Oldsmobile. Now, I thought, this is something, I won't have to deal with the gas fumes anymore. Well, the Oldsmobile didn't have a top on it, and it didn't have a windshield. So in the elements, in the rain, or the cold, or whatever, you either froze to death or you drowned. And we used the Oldsmobile for many, many Clendenen tours. And being at, I guess top speed was what, 20 miles an hour? Well, I never remember going what we would do is, at lunchtime, he would stop and get gas. Now, this is a little two-seater Oldsmobile, so togetherness, we were really togetherness. But, yeah, but we would stop and get gas. We had to eat lunch when he stopped and got gas, because then I would run in and get a couple sandwiches made and come running out again, and then we'd go on again, and we would eat our lunch as we were traveling. Now, that was bad enough, but on the early Clendenen tours, we stayed in a hotel like this that had parking garages underneath. Now, what we had to do was be in the parking garage like at 4 or 4:30 in the morning so that we were ready to roll when the sun came up. When daylight first came through that you could see, we were ready to roll, and we would drive all day. And then, I can't tell you how many nights we pulled into the next hotel, and I had a flashlight holding it so people would see the car coming down the road. I kid you not, this is what we did. And we would get there, and of course, all these big cars would pass us, and I was so jealous. But anyway, what can I tell you? I was young and I was in love. Then Herb finally came home with a 1911 Palmer Singer. Now you think we moved up in the world, right? Well, wasn't too sure about that. That Thomas Flyer over there is in pristine condition compared to what he bought. When he brought it home, I cried, and his mother put her arms around me and patted my shoulder.
Leave her alone.
His mother put her arms around me and patted my shoulder to soothe me and comfort me. And she turned to him and she said, "Herb, you really didn't spend your money on that, did you?" But we had the big passenger, the 7-passenger, and boy, we were living. And we took it out one tour, I guess one of the first tours we took it out. It took 4 years for him and his dad to restore it. And we took it out with the kids, the 2 kids on the tour. And Herb had done a wonderful job of lining the basket in the back, the trunk in the back with red material. And I thought, this is great. This is going to be our suitcase. I'll pack everything in there, and we don't have to worry about suitcases. Everything go in there. We'll just carry the trunk in at night. Well, the first day out, it rained, and guess what? The trunk leaked. And the Singe family wore pink clothes. But anyway, it's been fun, and I think I haven't made up my mind yet. Next time around, I don't think I'm going to get involved with somebody that has antique cars. But anyway, I'm not young anymore, I'm old, but I still am in love with antique cars, okay?
That's not gonna do it, Herb.
Say that again, Jeff, it's gonna take more than that.
I'll buy her a lunch tomorrow. Am I next?
Yeah, you're on, Herb. It's on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Really? I'm not a speaker, so I don't know where to start. Let me think. When I was 19 or 20, I got a job with a dress fair in Baltimore. Make it quick. I went to Cleveland, Ohio for school, and when I was out there, I saw Thompson Products on a corner, and had a lot of cars in the window. I looked at that, and I was always going to stop. I was on a bus then, going back and forth to school with some other guys like myself. And I looked at that Thompson Products corner every day, and I said, someday when I go home, I'm going to look for an old car, and I'm going to paint it up, I'm going to restore it myself, you know. So anyway, quick, I went home, looked at the Newark Evening News, found a 23 Ford coupe, bought it for $40, dragged it home, and my father said, oh my God, he said, where did you ever get that piece of junk? And I said, well, you know, we brought it home, and he said, look, he said, I'll leave my car out. I've never left it out before in my life. He said, my modern Chevrolet. He said, put it in the garage so the neighbors can't see it. He said, I don't want anybody to see it. He said, they'll think we're collecting junk. To make a long story short, my dad got involved with the car and me, and before you know it, I restored that car to like brand new. It had almost everything new on it. That was written up in Popular Science in '52 when it built himself a new car, because it was probably about 3/4 new with parts. I even found a new body for it in a crate. And Margaret opened up to me when I bought that. She still remembers that, I think. But anyway, then I joined, I met somebody I found a Maxwell, 1909 or 10 Maxwell in a paper, and it said $200. So I went up to look at this Maxwell, and I think it was $200 or $175, and it didn't have a magneto gear on it. Came back and told my dad, he says, where would you ever find a Maxwell gear, he said. He said, don't buy that car, don't buy a nice touring car, all original. And he says, where would we ever find a Maxwell? We didn't know Jerry Chase at the time. He probably would have made one for $3 in them days. But anyway, I didn't buy the Maxwell, and I still kept the Model T Ford. Well, I joined the Greenwood Lake region, which was 50 miles from our house, of AHCA. And I joined the AHCA, I should say first of all, I joined the AHCA, VMC, the Veteran Motor Car Club, and Horseless Carriage Club, through people that I met over the year after that. And I joined all three clubs in 1950, or 49 or 50, I'd say. And I got my membership certificate here, and it's signed by Bernie Goodell. Yours is signed by Eastwood, yeah. And Lindley Bothwell signed it here, and mine is July 1950. And I really wanted to start a Horseless Carriage Club, because I was going up to Greenwood Lake all the time, 50 miles away. I got very interested as a young kid. This was probably in 1949, I was probably 23 years old. And in the meantime, I met Jerry Durier, the son of, not Frank, the other one, Charles, yeah. I met him. And Jerry, I remember his age because he was, at that time, he was 45, I think. I thought he was an old man, you know, but he was probably my dad's age. But anyway, I told him I was going to start a Horseless Carriage Club region, and he really got adamant. He really said, oh, Herb, you can't do that. You're an AHCA territory. That's the West Coast. And so anyway, by the time I got an application form and a letter from Lindy Bothwell, how to start a region, you had 15 members, I got the rosters of all three clubs, and I couldn't really get enough members to start Horseless Carriage Club. They weren't members already. I tried to talk to some people, and they said, I don't want to join a club in the West Coast and pay dues just to have a club over here. We'll start a New Jersey region of AHCA. But I didn't want to do that. But anyway, Jerry Durier talked me into it. And right now we have still 300 members. But the unfortunate part about it, there was brass cars for the first 10 or 15 years. Then after that it went new. Now they talk about going on tours, which they do every year. But in the highlights they say so-and-so's
electric door switch didn't work, and so-and-so's air conditioner turned off. And, well, Mark and I went on a Glidden tour probably 20 years ago. We've been on probably 25 Glidden tours. And the last one we went on about 25 years ago, she said, this isn't for me. She said, this is not. We took a 35 Ford. And she said, this isn't for me. In the meantime, I took an 11 Palmer Singer on a tour. And we were, one or two people had brass cars. The people with Fords and Chevys would look at it and say, it's an old car, and that's all. They wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't mean anything to most of the chrome people. So, what was I getting at? Yeah, so New Jersey region, but anyway.
Getting active in the horses carriage.
All right, so then, about 20 years ago, I guess I didn't join, the New Jersey region started with John Hovey in New Jersey. And I remember I went up to his house to join. He said, Herb, you got to be a Horseless Carriage Club member. So I put out all 30 or 40 membership cards I had. And he said, oh, you are a member. I said, yeah. So anyway, I joined that. And then Margaret and I went on the first, we didn't go on Skip Carpenter's tour. Yes, we went on Skip Carpenter's tour, Grass and Gas up in Rutland, Vermont. And Margaret said, boy, this is great. She said, this reminds me of the old days. And we've been going on them ever since. We've probably been on 100 tours since then. And we've enjoyed it. Skip and Don run a super Grass and Gas up in New England area usually. And we've had a lot of fun over the years. And we really haven't been back to HCCA, although I have a few newer cars, mostly brass cars, and that's what we really like. But the early cars are really our love. And I've been working on cars since I'm not retired, but I am, but I work on cars all the time with my friend Bob in the back, Rachel Bob, and he helps me with my cars, and my son helps with talking about them. What else can I say? I don't know. Do you have any?
We'll get that. Certificate. Let me see your certificate.
Oh, you want to see the certificate? Okay. Do you have any questions out there?
Good, John.
Herb, I think you should talk to people because you've been to one or two Hershey swap meets and they would like to know when you got started.
Oh, yeah. All right.
How about the
Hershey,
first 10 or 20 years of Hershey?
I was on the board of directors of HCCA as a young kid. Jerry Duryea took a liking to me. He had two daughters. They were both single. One was older than me, and one was a little younger than me. And we used to go out, and I'd sat with him and ate a few times. That's around the time I just met Margaret. We weren't going steady or anything. But I met Margaret around the time I bought the first Model T Ford. She worked for my dad at Singe after school as a secretary. And then,
Jerry Duryea.
yeah.
Hershey.
Oh, Hershey, okay. Wait to get 85 plus.
You're on the board.
All right, I was on the board, and I still remember we were down Bill Bowden's cellar in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, and a fellow named Jimmy Ladd come up and he says, you know, he said, I can get the Hershey Stadium. He said, for a fall meet. And everybody looked up and said, hey, that's great. That's where they make chocolate, I think. Yeah. Different people start talking about it. And Jimmy Ladd got the board of directors to say, okay. And I went to the first Hershey. And my last one was last October. And I hope to go to my 59th Hershey in October. And about 10 years ago, I guess, 7 years ago, John? Yeah. They moved one field to the other. It used to be a lot of mud fields. So the mud field over there, and a mud field over here, and a mud field here, and a mud field over there, and a flood field over here. There was a lot of mud fields and flood fields and everything. A lot of you remember it. And, but they since ironed that all out. And I talked to a few people, and I knew a lot of people from years ago, and I still have a lot of contacts there. And I talked to most of the Horseless Carriage Club members that I knew, or that had spaces in these bad fields, and I said, let's all get together if I can. So I finally had somebody that was in the Hershey region I knew pretty well, as a woman, and she said, I'll talk to so-and-so for you, Herb. And anyway, I talked to them, and they said, take everybody's application form, have them send it to you, and put it in one envelope and FedEx it to me, and I'll see what I can do. Well, I think we probably have about the best field in the field. You think so, John?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. But a bunch of fellows wouldn't go with me. Not a bunch. There's 10 or 15. didn't want to go, they were afraid to send me the application form, thought it would get lost or something, and I can't blame them in a way. And then after we got it, got the field and got everything, they said, hey, how can I get in there? I said, well, I'll tell you how you can get in there. You just tell this fella and this fella and this fella to get out and don't send their money, and you take that space. Yeah. But anyway, it's hard to get in space near us, but we've got a few already. Herb has been taking care of that.
Hershey's.
When we used to hold our meets years ago in Hershey, we put the cars inside the stadium. And what they would do was they would give us the key at the Hershey office. They would give Herb or George or whoever was in charge the key and say, okay, just make sure when you're finished using the stadium, you bring the key back. And that's what we did. And then a couple of fellas got the idea that maybe they would put some parts in the trunks of their car. And they came to Hershey and they opened up their trunks and they had parts for sale. And these guys were like flies after you know what, seeing all these parts laying in these trunks. It was like, oh. But anyway, that's how it actually started, was they sold parts out of their trunk. And believe it or not, there were some people in Hershey that were on the board that didn't want that. They did not want us selling parts out of their car. And one fellow said, hey, I've had looking for a part that I bought yesterday, I've been looking for 10 years. Don't tell me about buying parts. So that's how they started, by selling out of the trunks of their car.
Now, Margaret, doesn't Herb still have them parts?
Yes.
Parts out of the trunk, but I knew some of the fellows that were doing it. The one story I can tell real quick, Mail and Pat was the one fellow that said, I think this is not right for the club. He said, people are trying to make money on this thing. I think they shouldn't be there. Another fellow stood up, he's Paul Marvel, he said, that sounds, he said, I want to rebuttal with you. He said, I think they should pay if they want to come. Another fellow says it was Jim Grundy's Jim Grundy's grandfather, not his father, no, so Jim Grundy's, well, Jim.
His wife's father.
His wife's father, yeah.
His father-in-law.
Father, yeah. He said, I've been looking for, he's the one that said, I've been looking for something for a long time, and he said, I finally found it was for Pierce Arrow, I think. And he said, I think the price was right, and he said, I think they're doing right by doing this. And before you know it, that's how Hershey started. I walked around with Paul Marvel, I remember, I was only a kid, and he said, why don't you go around with me, Herb, and we collected $3 off this guy, and the next guy, we said, well, give me $5. We said, you got more than him. He said, well, I didn't sell anything yet. All right, give me $4. That's how we done it. It was up and down the field, you know. But it's what I used to do. My dad used to go with me, with my mom. They had one car and I had another car. So we parked one car next to the stadium, so we'd have a place to sit and eat and everything, right next to the stadium. Everything was in the stadium, so we'd park it right from here to that Thomas away, you know. And we'd have a car there at night, on the night before, and that's how it was. It was only Saturday morning.
Tell them where the flea market started.
Well, the flea market started on the side of the stadium, but then it was in the stadium for 2 or 3 years around the back. It was a small race car a small racetrack for midget racing. And the back of the stadium went up in the air, and that's where the flea market was for the first 2 or 3 years. And you could buy lamps for $5 and $10 and $20. Well, everything's relative, you know. The one thing about Mail and Pat, I can tell you a real quick story about him. I don't know how many people you know, but he bought a Thomas Flyer in the middle 50s. And he paid $20,000. Well, that was like unbelievable. So much money, and everybody said, "You're crazy. You're nuts. You're out of your mind." They gave all kind of, and they laughed at him and everything. Well, he kept it 10 or 15 years, I guess. And he sold it for, I think, $120,000 or
$175.
How much?
$175. 70 horsepower.
Right, so anyway, whatever it was, he photographed the check, and he remembered all the fellows because they were on the board. Most of them were, I didn't say it because I mean, that money was twice as much as my house cost, you know? So I never gave it a thought, you know? That was like buying a 747 today, you know? It's out of reach. So anyway, he photographed the check, and he sent it to all of them. He said, "How nuts do you think I was?" You know. So, any other questions? I can answer questions easier than. All
right. How about we do a couple bullet points and just let everybody just kind of say something. Who wants to talk about the Reno tours for right now? Reno tours?
Go ahead, start it. Start it.
Well, my experience on the Reno tour was,
Tell what the real tour was.
well, for those of you that don't know, they were sponsored by Harrah's Club, Bill Harrah, and he would invite anybody and everybody that had a brass or a car to come on the tours. And they were first-class tours, and he put a lot of money into them. He charged a fee, which covered some of the food, and you paid for your lodging, but he covered everything else, and they were first class. You would get up in the morning and you would have breakfast, and you get to the lunch stop, and they would have white linen tablecloths or gingham tablecloths on the tables, and they'd have these buffet lines, and they were like the Las Vegas hotels today for any of you that have ever been to any of those. And I mean, it was just incredible food that was put out there. And then when you got to the evening meal, you would go to one of his clubs, and they would have entertainment and the dinner show, and it was really first class. And the entertainment was always some, headliner from Broadway, or like Herb says, Sammy Davis. Anyway, the first tour I went on, it was James Melton put on the main show. Of course, he was a member of the club and knew about old cars, and they brought old cars onto the stage, and they put a whole big act together was centered around old cars. But anyway, how I got in to go on the first one, there was a fellow that was a member of the Newport Beach Regional Group. His name was Jack Quinn. He had several cars, and he and his wife had a guy that had restored a baby grand Chevrolet for him, and I'd helped the guy out some. And his name was Jim Van Horn, who did the restoration, also a member of the club, had several cars. So they invited me to go along. I was, I believe I was 18 years old at the time, and that was a thrill to get to go on that tour. Then got to do a couple of others after that. Ken here was also on that tour, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more.
Well, early on I got to know a lot of the big collectors, and I was just a kid, but they soon, it didn't take them long talking to me to know that I really cared about cars and had seen a lot of them. And the Reno tours were so, there were people that the only reason they had a car was to attend the Reno tour. And you had to go on the Reno tours, you had to have your car looked at. And it was Bill Harrah's way of having an influence on the restoration. And one of the things that in the early days was the wheel size of the wheels on the cars. And a lot of cars had the wrong wheel size. It kind of really hurt the appearance of the car. But Bill Harrah wouldn't let that car on the tour if it had the wrong size wheels on it. And it wasn't that he was trying to tell anybody anything, except that on his tours he would encourage people to do good restorations and correct restorations. And I was working for him very early on, and people cared. They cared that you did the right thing for the cars, and they were glad. Instead of being, when I'd go to look at the car and say, yes, you can come on the tour, they were glad you were there to tell them what to do. They didn't know anybody, and so it really did help the restorations, and that's the way I remember the Reno tours.
Brad, Peter, you're too young for Reno.
Well, my parents had 5 children, and the Reno tours were their vacation away from the kids, so I never went on a Reno tour. But my folks would come home from the Reno tours. My dad took a lot of slides, and some of you may have seen the slideshow on Wednesday that we did here, but there would just be these incredible photographs of incredible roads and beautiful scenery, and I mean, it's Lake Tahoe, Reno, you can't go wrong for scenery up there. And Dad would always, he would talk about how you'd be winding down this wonderful little road, and you'd come around the corner and there'd be a meadow, and it would be full of tables with tablecloths and china and silverware, and you were in the middle of nowhere, and it was this incredible feed, and somebody's got to help me here. At the peak of the Reno tours, they would have over 300 cars. And it was the best of the best, and it was, and the time, I mean, and Hera just, he just put on the best of everything for those tours, and the people that got to go really got to experience something special.
Every other year.
Now,
What were the years of those tours?
50 to
66 was the last.
1950, I think, was the first one.
Well, we had one in 48.
64.
And then we had a real, nationally advertised one in 1950. And the last one I went on with my own car was 68.
68.
That was the last one.
Yeah, I made each and every one of those tours. My parents, one of them had.
well, to get with Ken and the authenticity of the car, in about 1967, I finished my 13 Ford, and boy, was I a proud guy. And I drove it up Warwick Eastwood's driveway, and I said, there's a Reno tour coming up in the summer, I'd like to go. And he says, well, we'll get the judging form out and we'll see if you can go. And I said, okay. So he gets it out and he looks at the car and he says, well, number one, it doesn't have the right body. And I, wait a minute, what do you mean? He says, painted blue, 1913, didn't have blue Fords. He says, doesn't have wheels. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, wire wheels? Well, anyway, it was a 150-point judging sheet, and I ended up with 15 points. So therefore, I never went on a Reno tour with my Model T.
Even though my dad and my uncle were twins, they were, as much as they were similar, they were that much different too. They grew up on Model Ts, and out of that childhood experience, my uncle hated Model Ts, and my dad loved Model Ts. So you went to the wrong Eastwood to get a check.
That was your best ever restored car, right, Red?
Uh-oh.
Well, he didn't finish that one.
In 1952, I and my best friend then, who later was best man at our wedding, probably were the ones responsible for the judging sheet. We drove up there in a somewhat less than pathetic Model T Jitney and had a lot of fun. And that time we didn't have a trailer. I lived in Alhambra, and my friend Frank Dupuy, who owned the Jitney, was in Pasadena, and we decided we would go on a Reno tour. So we sent in our application, got accepted, and the only way to get there was to drive it. And a Model T Jitney, which is on kind of a truck chassis, was pretty slow. We left Pasadena mid-afternoon. I do remember that we were up somewhere up south of Bishop. We'd gotten that far, gotten over the mountain pass there. And Warwick and Millie went by pulling a Buick, two-cylinder Buick with their then fairly new 1951 six-cylinder Chevy, but they passed us and waved as they went by. We had to drive all night because the tour was the next started. So one of us would drive and the other would sleep in the back of the Jitney, and we made it in 24 hours up there, non-stop. And they did appreciate us up there because before we left, I had printed a bunch of transfers, and we called ourselves the Metropolitan Rapid Transit Company. The Jitney is still in existence, by the way. And so we gave Jitney service up and down the street near the hotel where we stayed in Reno, and we were the last ones to bed, and I guess the first ones up the next morning, because we were sober. And offered free jitney service to anybody that wanted to ride or was would tolerate us. So that's my experience. It was a lot of fun. We were well accepted, but we didn't have the best car on the tour.
Any of the other gentlemen down there have any Reno tour experience they'd like to discuss? If not,
I just want to say one
go ahead. Go ahead.
This is a little bit about the Reno tour from another perspective. After I got into this thing in '64 and found some 13 Monte parts I was trying to put together as a kid, working there in the shop, I had two other mentors that should be mentioned from SoCal. One was Howard Ashhead, and the other was John Wagamot. Well, anyway, there's a new fellow came on the scene with some new ideas and new products, and he was Bernie Green, and he heard about this Reno tour, and he wanted to go on the Reno tour, and he bought a 13 Ford from John Wagamot, but it had natural wood wheels, demountable rims, hydraulic brakes that I think Doug Eastwood had conjured up in the early days, and a Ruxtol. Well, Bernie couldn't go because Warwick wouldn't let any of those things go on the Reno tour. So my first restoration job was to build up a straight riveted rear end for a 13 Ford, get a set of non-demountable wheels, 30x3 in the front, 30x3.5 in the back, and get rid of those hydraulic brakes. And I did. Bernie was in business, and he showed me two things that were new in the mid-60s. He showed me two ceramic tiles held together with this opaque, sort of translucent white stuff that was flexible, and you couldn't twist it apart. It was called silicone. And this was something he was marketing. It was just amazing. And these two, and you couldn't switch them. And he says, well, I'm in the packaging business. I said, what do you mean? Well, see this big piece of machinery? Look, this is how we're packaging it. And it was molded in styrofoam. And I said, well, it's not as strong as a wood crate. He says, it doesn't have to be as strong. It just has to do the job. And that was new in about 1964. So anyway, not that pertinent, but there was a lot of other things that flowed out. But he did get approved by Warwick, and he did go on one of the last Reno tours.
And in all your wisdom, you invested in neither of those, right, Lauren?
No, I don't know anything about anything new. So
Now, the Reno tours were not Horseless Carriage Club of America tours. They were private tours. We now have 5 to 8 national tours a year in the Horseless Carriage Club, both on the East Coast, West Coast, and sometimes the Midwest. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was really only one national tour every year, most years, and that was the annual Horseless Carriage Club of America Caravan. So who wants to talk about the Horseless Carriage Club caravans? Don't all raise your hands at once.
I'll talk about that.
There you go, Peter.
Well, I wasn't there, but the very first Horseless Carriage Caravan left downtown Los Angeles and drove all the way to Riverside, California, and stayed at the Mission Inn. And I forget quite a number of cars, including Oldsmobile Limited, on that tour. And this was in 1948. And Tom Thompson showed the plaque. That was actually awarded years later to each of the cars that participated on that first national caravan in 1948. So that's when it started. It was the first national tour.
Oh, one other person that I think one of our members who's passed on might be mentioned because it was a milestone. You may all remember Roy LaForce of Wichita, Kansas. Well, the first meeting that I was elected to the national board was Marion Welch's last meeting held down in Downey, and from then on there were a lot of changes. Later on, Roy came on the board and he envisioned not the Horseless Carriage Club just being a West Coast club. He envisioned tours all across the country. He envisioned a mid-continent tour and an East Coast tour. And you have to really give it to Roy LaForce to be the one that spread the club across the United States, because it was his inspiration that led to multiple tours all over the country. Thank you.
That's for sure. This one says, if you go on a, well, here, I just opened up, is this on? I don't hear it, no.
This one's hot.
Just a second, this one gave some rules and regulations on it. Fifth in 1952, the Horseless Caravan. It says you must carry public liability. All occupants of participating cars are to wear appropriate costumes during touring periods and for the dinner dance on Sunday night. For the men, caps and dusters worn with street clothes will be acceptable. No commercial advertising. I'm just trying to see what the dinner costs. It costs us a little more here. A couple was $15, is that what it was? No, to go on a tour, it was $15. Single was $5. I don't know why a couple was, why would a couple be $15 and a single be $5? I can't figure that out. And you say you're under Ann Boswell in Woodland Hills, California. This whole packet of stuff I got in the early 50s.
Alan's going to talk about some of the early horseless carriage caravans and, the problems that were encountered. And one big eventually led to the solving of the biggest problem for Horseless Carriage Club members in the 40s and 50s.
Well, I was only on one caravan, and that was the last one that was a national tour in 1963. And I had a freshly restored 1912 SGV. And people not everyone had trailers in those days. And if they wanted to go on events, they drove their cars there. I didn't have a trailer. And I drove from Newport Beach, California to Monterey. And the tour started in San Luis Obispo, and that was about 300 miles from where I lived. And we did a 300-mile day from there to the start of the tour. Then we drove on, and then we drove all the way home after it was over with. So, and that's the way it was done prior to that time. I remember some of the old-timers telling about the biggest problems that they had on tours and why a lot of cars had their wheels cut down was they couldn't get tires. And they were always looking for tires. And and I don't remember what year it was that the money was put up for Garrick to, maybe Herb can tell a little bit about that. Here, let me finish here. Anyway, but then without trailers, it was a challenge to get places too. I remember some of the first people that had trailers, and people drove to the Reno tours in Reno from Southern California and from other parts of the U.S. and Washington, Oregon, and places where people came from. We just trailered. And the first couple of times I trailered, I had to borrow a trailer from somebody. The first time was on an implement trailer, and that was a challenge. Anyway, that was because of the desire to be there and go on those tours. But anyway, Herb will tell you a little bit about how Gary got in the tire business.
Does anybody else know the story about Gary Tires? Go ahead, Tom.
No, I don't.
Oh.
I just wanted to mention one thing on the early tours. The mobile gas supplied all the gas, so we just pulled in the service station and they filled your car up with gas for free. Auto Club brought a trouble truck along, so you didn't have to worry about if your car broke down. They had a trouble truck and a trailer. Free gas. If you tell people now, they'd never believe you.
As Alan said, the main thing in the 40s and 50s were tires for the old cars. And my dad was offered a Olds Limited in 1956 before he bought his Palmer Singer in 1955. It's the one that sold a couple of years ago and restored for $1,650,000. Of course, if my dad had gotten it, it would be restored, so it would have been worth $1,650,000 as the only unrestored one. But he was dissuaded by the owner, which was his dad and Bill Swigert, the owner. He said, Herb, he says, you can't get tires for the car's no good. You paid me $4,000 for the car, but he said, you're not going to be able to get tires. He said, the molds are expensive. He said, I don't want to spend for it. He said, I think I have more money than you do. He owned an insurance company. He had a lot more money than my dad did. But that was a big problem. So the Horseless Carriage Club was the leader in trying to get tires for old cars. Eventually the tires were running out and guys were putting tractor tires on, whatever they could find, and tires were gold. And just like that tires were the main thing, just like they were in 1905 and 10, main thing of early cars. So the Horseless Carriage Club America put up a prize, kind of a bounty. I think they selected 4 or 5 or 6, and it was 6 common-sized tires, 36 by 5, things like that. And they said any company that will build molds and produce 100 And once you produce 100, they're going to produce more. 100 of each of these tires, as soon as they produce 100 of all the sizes, we will pay them a prize. I think the prize was $5,000, it was $1,000, $5,000, or $10,000. I don't really remember. $10,000? Thank you, John.
I asked that all the local groups to give contributions.
That's right, okay. All the regions gave contributions, and it was a big thing. And a couple guys started, but a guy in Indiana by the name of Garrett, he started building, and sure enough, he came up with all the sizes, he did it, and he got the prize. And I'll say this, I shouldn't tell you this, but once in a while you find a Garrett tire in the field, and I like them. My Loja's got Garrett tires, and they're 50 some odd years old, and I don't want them to run anything else, so I try to find them. So they wear like iron, not like the tires nowadays. But and now, of course, we have Coker and Lucas, and it's a big business. But anyway, all right. Anything else? Or you want me to go for it? Okay. Next thing I was going to ask about was two guys acquired. The two gentlemen here brought their wives. They each acquired a special car in their lives. I'd like to talk each one to talk about how they acquired this special car in their lives. I don't know if it's the most special car in Chuck's life, but I know it's the most special car in Herb's life. I'll let Chuck do it first because I think he acquired it before my dad acquired his. Tell the story about your Model T, getting your Model T.
The Ford that I drive the most is the 1913 Ford Touring. I finished college in January of 1950 and was fortunate enough to get a mid-year job with the Alhambra School District as a brand new machine shop and auto shop teacher. I had enough money to carry me over for the first month till I got my first paycheck. My first paycheck was for the month of February in 1950. The check was for $210 for a month's pay for a brand new teacher. I cashed the check. With that, I had $200 and a few dollars left over for gas. For that $200, I bought the 1913 Ford Touring, which had been put up on blocks at the beginning of World War II. I towed it with my Model A Ford, which is my transportation at the time, up to a gas station, put some gas in it, made sure the tires were filled. I had to bring two front wheels with tires because those 30x3s weren't available, and so I had to bring my own tires. Anyway, I put gas in this car, put some water in the radiator, towed it 50 feet out of the gas station. A friend of mine was with me. He turned on the key and it started and ran. And I did no engine work on that for about 30 more years. It just ran well, and I just kept driving it. That's the one we drove on our honeymoon trip up to the Bay Area in 1954, and it's been part of our life ever since. Greatest $200 investment I ever made. And over the years, that engine just keeps going. It still has all its original parts except for a set of rings and the cotter pins and the con rods. It just keeps on going. It's got two-piece cast iron valves and cast iron pistons, and I'm very happy with it. It's been a very loyal, faithful car.
Thank you, Chuck.
What do you think of it?
No comments.
I just wanted to say, dinner's on your own tonight. We're going to be closing this room in a little bit when this is concluded to set up for this evening's presentation with the Thomas Flyer. So there's a restaurant in the hotel. There's also more of an informal place where you can eat and get some things out here. But I don't think they're set up to service all at once. So if you're planning on having dinner, we need to think about where you're going to go and getting that done here pretty soon.
Okay, am I next here? Where do I start now? Had a 1904 Olds for a long time, but the most significant car I got to get to. And we went to the French Lick, Indiana, Glidden Tour. I forget what year that, oh, I know exactly what year that was. That was 1956. And we were out there, and I was talking to Austin Clark, Bill Snyder, Whitney Snyder. So I said, I got to get a bigger car one of these days because we're planning on having a family. We were married already a couple of years. And so anyway, Austin Clark comes up to me. He says, Herb, you know that Palmer Singer, he said, that's around you? I said, I never heard of that one. He said, well, it's in Ridgewood, New Jersey. He said, you should go up and buy that. And then he started talking to me. He came back and talked to me an hour or so later. And there was a couple more stories about it. But he said, I'll tell you what, I always wanted that car, he said. But he said, if you want it, you buy it. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you don't like it, you get it home. He said, do you have the money for it? I said, yeah. I said, I can get the money for it. It was $3,000. So he says, you drag it home, he says, or bring it home, he said, and whatever expenses you incur to bring it home, trailer or something, he said, I'll add that to the, I'll pay you $100 profit. I was making that about $75 a week or maybe 90, something around there. And he says, so you can't lose. So he said, get the car, and Bob Miller was on the tour with us, and he said, I know Pat Boyle. I told a couple people about this thing. And he said, I know Pat Boyle real well. He has the car. He said, I'll bring him a ham up and meet you there, Herb. He said, and he says, you can get the car. He said, otherwise if you go up there cold, he said, he may throw you out. So anyway, he must have made arrangements, and I met Miller, and we went up to see Pat Boyle. I looked over the car, and I said, boy, this is great. I'm going to buy it. And but people told me in the meantime it was no good because the car sat up in the back like this, sat up like this in the back. And the gas tank was all dented in and everything. Well, when they moved it with a wrecker, I guess they must have put the chain around the rear end, around the gas tank, lifted up in the air. The shackles, which are 4 inches high, were turned the other way, and that made it 8 inches up in the air, so it looked like it was going downhill. And I looked at it right away. I was mechanically inclined then, and I was working on cars. I looked at it, I said, well, that's nothing. I just knew what it was right away. And so I ended up buying a car, and on the way home, Bob Miller gave me $100, and he said, Pat gave me $100 to bring you up here to sell you a car. He said, because you paid his price. So I says, I don't want it. He said, no, you take. He was a wealthy guy. But anyway, I got that. That's how I got my Palmer Singer. Is that all you want me to say, Herb? That's it, I guess. So that's how I got the Palmer Singer, and I still got it.
Surprisingly enough, in that same garage was, what's Leslie's car?
Stan Cope's, Peerless.
Yeah, the Peerless that Stan Cope bought. And the two cars used to live together. And now on national or tours in the East, Les Holden from North Carolina owns Stan Cope's car, and the two cars now get to see each other, which is kind of interesting.
And our family has a 1905 Buick in the garage that's been in the garage, our garage since 1946.
Oh, the main thing I want to say, there's one thing I got to tell you. I said we were planning on having a family. 9 months later, Herb was born.
After he bought the Palmer Singer.
And we had 5 kids in our family, and my dad said every time he'd bring home another old car, my mom would have another kid, so he quit bringing home old cars.
Maybe he didn't quit a couple cars earlier, Peter. Well, folks, we got enough to talk about for another couple of hours, but quickly, everybody can talk for 30 seconds and sum up if you want to say something else. If you don't, just say, we're going to do this again, because I think it's very valuable. Here you go, I'm going to start, Alan.
Well, I'm probably a little too young to be up here with all these old timers, but anyway, it's been fun, and I've had a great life, the Horseless Carriage Club. Thank you.
Well, it's been my whole life, and I'm not done yet, still having fun.
Me too. Not that old, but I love this hobby and I love the club, and we're having a great time.
All my friends on the West Coast, East Coast, and throughout the world are old car people. And I have a few Rotarian friends back in where I live. But other than that, everybody is an early car guy or a gal.
I just hope I can teach my grandchildren. I have only one grandson and 2 granddaughters. I've got to teach them enough to take care of this fleet of cars that we have now.
Yeah.
remember to give a stranger a ride, because he might turn you into another Bobby Babcock. That's right. And the Maxwell's still in my garage.
Yeah.
About 1950, there was an article in Ford Times magazine about Bobby Babcock and a little car that he made. Anyhow, this summer too is going to be the 40th anniversary of Doc Schaefer passing. And when Doc Schaefer first started his practice in San Bernardino, it was in a high-rise building. And the elevator operator was a young man in there at the time, and his name was Lyndon Johnson.
Wow.
Here you go, Conrad, 30 seconds.
For what?
Whatever you want to say.
Goodbye.
All right, we got two more guys we gotta say something to. One's John McNichol, he's gonna say something for 30 seconds. I didn't realize that he's as old and crusty as he is and been in the hobby this long. He probably should have been up on DS, but anyway, he's gonna tell you something quick.
Yeah, I was born in this hobby. My parents were horseless carriage. I met all the greats. We spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, I was born in transit in '46. That my dad took my mother with him to go look at a car. I want to close in a statement. And yes, my parents pretty much brought Con into this horseless carriage thing. And his lovely old wife, Lynn, she was a delight to the world. But I could go on forever. He gave me 30 seconds. I want to tell you something my mother taught me when I was a little boy. She said, cars are cars, and we really couldn't have this hobby without cars. But I want you to learn something right now. It's not the cars. It's a horseless carriage organization. It's the people.
Last, but certainly not least, one of the most influential old car guys in the last 40 or 50 years. Did the biggest deal on cars ever, pretty much. Ken Gooding. Here you go, Ken. You got a minute.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I should talk about that deal we did.
Can you do it in a minute?
Yeah, I
2 minutes?
do it pretty quickly. When Harris Collection became available, nobody knew, well, they didn't even know it was kind of available. They had an auction up there, and they got so much money for a couple of the cars that they said, hey, we got to sell more of these. And I heard that. And so I went to and put a deal together, and I was going to get maybe 4 or 5 guys to buy these 87 cars, which was going to be about $30 million.
That's the last 87 they're going to sell, right?
Yeah. And so I went to a couple of guys, and the second guy I went to was Jack Nethercutt, and he said, well, Ken, do you mind if I just do it? Well, that was great. But the one thing was we had to come up with cash for the thing. And that kind of money's unbelievable. Well, I can tell you, I got a cashier's check for $29,700. And, I mean, $29 million, yeah. And handed it over to him, and that's the way we got that collection. And as much as that was, by the time he sold the cars that he didn't want, pretty much paid for his whole thing. So he did real good. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'm reminded here that was General Lyons that did that, not Jack Nethercutt, and that's absolutely true. When I called up General Lyons, he wanted to just do it on its own, and he did.
Okay, the folks here at the hotel need to set up this room for the next event, and they need to clean up, so everybody needs to go outside. And at 6:30, they'll open the doors, and the presentation on the Thomas will be at 7. So thank you very much for attending this collector's forum.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.